Hello, welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and I know, folks, it's probably starting to look like every time Bob Murphy and I get together, it's like we have a contract that we have to talk about whatever interesting conversation Tucker had this week. But I swear this was just a coincidence. Somebody sent Bob Murphy a bunch of things that Oren Cass said on this interview about economics and trade and tariffs, and it was interesting. I thought we should talk about it too, because he also defines conservatism and how he thinks government should be used to influence society in ways that I think are very much worthwhile pointing out, drawing attention to, focusing on. And so we ended up having a really interesting conversation about all that, and I hope you enjoy it.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
So why don't you just tell me? I mean, which one of Tucker Carlson's interviews do you want to cover today?
I was thinking the Oren Cass one, and at least we're not covering another Twitter battle, and we could have done that. There was some. I poked fun at Europeans, and I got 35,000 hearts. I'm just gonna put that out there.
Which stock do you buy or sell based on that reaction?
I'm not sure, but I am going to, in the interest of science, talk about light speed rail and then also make fun of Europeans because I have to figure out exactly what was it about the tweet.
It's the smell. All right, enough about Europeans. So who is this Oren Cass fellow, and why is he in his conversation so interesting?
Yes. So, folks, just to frame what you're going to experience in the next whatever length of time this takes us, Oren Cass is I think he's got a degree from Harvard Law, and right now his current position is he's the economist at the American Compass, an organization that he founded that's right of center. And the big thing is right now he's going around making the case that free trade has failed. And these economists who have been pushing it for decades, especially as it was embraced among the American conservative, libertarian, right-wing Republican types, he thinks that they were misled by the economists. And so that's been his mission, is to show them the way, and in particular, like the loss of U.S. manufacturing and stuff like that. But I knew Oren earlier. I think he was a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I first he came on my radar when I was an economist at the Institute for Energy Research, and the carbon tax was like my baby, and I was like the guy on that stuff among right-wing policy analyst types. And then I was at this conference one time, and people kept talking about this Oren guy. I said, what? And he just went through and did a bullet point. Like, here's all the arguments for a carbon tax, and he just addressed each of them and gave real. And I was actually a bit like, why is everyone talking about that guy? I thought this was my beat, So anyway, so there was that element. But no, he's real sharp. And then I read some of his stuff. I won't dwell on it here, but it was really good. Like, he got into like these studies that were coming out talking about the damages from global warming and things. They were doing goofy stuff like not allowing people to install air conditioners. Like, they were looking at like for a 1 degree, if an unusually hot summer, and how many people does that kill in northern climates? And then they were just extrapolating 100 years in the future, even though in the model, like Philadelphia isn't going to be warmer than Arizona is right now, but yet 100 years from now, Philadelphia would have a higher mortality rate than Arizona right now, because they wouldn't think to install air conditioning and stuff like that, right? So he just went in, did all that. And then Tom and I also had him on Contra Krugman, that Oren did really good work. I think it was the Affordable Care Act had funding for Medicaid expansion among the states. And there was, some Republican governors refused the money and things like that. And so guys like Krugman were trying to argue about, see these idiots and how they're killing people. And Oren went into the data and showed that, no, actually it was the other way around, that it was the states that refused the funding had better mortality. Okay, so he was a real data-driven guy and was good and very sharp. And so that's how I knew him. So then he comes out swinging against free trade, and people like, I'll go ahead and name like Phil Magnus, has had Oren and recently accused him after this Tucker Carlson appearance of being a serial liar. stuff like that, right? And so, and people routinely saying Oren is just an idiot. He literally doesn't understand how comparative advantage works, when that's something you can teach undergrads. So anyway, I have taken the tack, and I even had Oren on recently on the Infi podcast, of saying, yeah, I disagree. I don't think tariffs help anything, but Oren's not an idiot. And no, if you go look at, and we'll get into this in the clips tonight, folks, some of his claims about the history of economic thought, that no, I disagree that Phil Magnus saying, oh yeah, he's just a liar, and other people just telling me, Bob, he really just he doesn't understand Ricardo. He just doesn't get, and that's not what's going on. And so my takeaway from this is, and we're going to get into some of this stuff about conservatism, folks, that in my judgment, it makes more sense to try to have a dialogue with a guy like this, as opposed to just saying, idiot, heretic, get out, among other things, because that serves his narrative. That only helps him recruit people. And last thing I'll say, Adam, we're going to look at some data and things like that. I think just strategically, kind of like the people that are concerned about anti-Semitism, and I think the exact worst thing for you to do is to label everyone who disagrees with you as a Jew hater or something. That same thing here. There are lots of people who are being drawn to the populist rhetoric and think that, something's going on with China. I don't trust China. And to just say, no, our trade deficit is because it's so awesome to invest here. End of story. You're an idiot if you don't get that. I don't think that's effective rhetorically. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, I don't either. And when you told me people were saying that he was stupid or dishonest, like stupid, obviously not. I'm going to have a lot of disagreements with some of the things he said, as we'll get to. I don't think he might be misrepresenting or slanting to make a point or something, but I don't think he's a liar. He just has a completely different vision of how he wants this country to be. Did you know? I mean, I looked this up on Wikipedia, so who knows? Those things are not exactly accurate, but apparently this guy worked on both Mitt Romney's presidential campaigns in 08 and 12. And he also, apparently right out of school, was working in Romney's management consulting firm, Bain and Company.
Bain Capital.
Yes. Yeah, Bain Capital.
On Tucker.
So he's like really a Romney guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that even came up like in the Tucker Carlson interview, that Tucker was saying, how did you get these views? Because one would have thought on paper you would be. Right. Yeah. And he admitted that, he said that he was in school when he was for the first campaign. I don't know if he said he was. I think he did actually say he was working at Bain Capital but yes, that's not some dark secret he hides. Like he's open about that, like in interviews.
All right,
and that's partly how he claims that. How like Trump tries to say, oh yeah, I know how corrupt it is because I used to pay the bribes myself or whatever. It's same kind of thing where he'll like say, yeah, I've been part of these mergers and acquisitions, and I'm making up stuff, but that's the way he handles that is to say, I see how this works, and it's not that they're saying what's best for blue collar workers. They go wherever the bottom line says it's good to outsource to.
All righty. Well, with enough intro there, are you ready to start diving into some?
Let's do it.
Cass words of wisdom.
The best way I think to see how badly things have gone is our trade imbalance, right? We get, we bring in more than $1 trillion more stuff from overseas every year than we sell to the rest of the world. That suggests that trade isn't working very well. Paul Krugman famously said trade deficits are self-correcting. There was an economic theory that said such imbalances won't persist. They will take care of themselves. Krugman, this was a discussion I was part of with him, and I said, like, why do you say that? And he said, like, yeah, that was naive. Like, just, sorry, we built an awful lot on that idea, and that was just wrong. You see the same thing, Janet Yellen, who was Biden's Treasury Secretary, has recently said, look, the standard economic model was if someone will send you something for cheaper, you just send a thank you note. And she said, I would never say that again. That just wasn't true. And so one reason we have not done it is because we actively believe things that were wrong. And we are fortunately now starting to realize that and try to fix it.
I would argue that's all clearly true. Slightly more complicated, though, because it wasn't just that people believed something that was wrong, now demonstrably. It was that the people who argued it was wrong weren't just like debated in good faith, they were destroyed as people. So the two biggest advocates of the position you're describing now were Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan. And both of them were kind of driven from public life on the basis of claims that they were like not just wrong on economics, but like dangerous, bad people.
Okay. So the reason and folks, just, like I picked a few clips, and then Adam picked a few, and I think we're going through mine first. The reason I thought that was a good one to discuss is because I wanted to get your take on this, Adam. So there, and we'll, in a minute, I think it's the next clip, folks, we'll get into Oren's specific claims about the Economist and how they misled people or whatever. But for right now, what I thought was more interesting there was, number one, he beats up on Paul Krugman. So I'm just telling people, like, he's a very good, right winger that's trying to, if you want to view it as seducing people away from the free trade light side to the dark side. Like he's very, you know what I mean? Like he's a very good, he has a lot of sheep's clothing on, if you want to view that, uses that metaphor.
He's beating up Paul Krugman for the only thing that Krugman is ever good on.
Exactly. Right. So it's interesting. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there. But the thing I'm curious your take. So mine is, Tucker's clearly right that, yeah, people who were just absolutely vilified, Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, and they happen to also be a big component of their worldview and their messaging or whatever was going away from free trade orthodoxy. But is that really, was that the thing? I guess where I'm coming from is I think it was more that there were clearly plenty of progressive politicians, with labor unions or whatever, that have always been against free trade and said, this is crazy. This is good for, shareholders, but it's not good for workers and stuff like that. Like that's pretty standard in U.S. politics on the left. So, one element, like in fairness, you could say, what Tucker meant was for among Republican conservative types, the two that did that. But even there, I would imagine if we scoured, we could find people who had advanced, protectionist arguments that weren't destroyed. I think the combination of factors was Buchanan and most specifically Perot were actually challenging the two-party system. Like they were really getting a foothold with the public, and that's why they were a threat and had to be destroyed, because they actually were, gaining a following and were popular. Just like, Ron Paul was ridiculed and whatever too. Yeah. It's not because he was deviating from free trade orthodoxy.
Yeah, he might grab the reins of power, and we can't have that.
Yeah. So, anyways, do you agree with that assessment that it's not something like, if you touch free trade, then you get destroyed by the establishment? It's more if you're like a populist leading an uprising against the establishment, you get destroyed. And probably if you are a populist leading an uprising against the establishment, one of the arrows in your quiver is going to be you're against NAFTA.
Exactly. Yeah. My ears perked up when I heard that too, because it sounded counter narrative. And then your framing occurred to me as well. Yeah, these are populists who were a threat to the regime, and that's why they might have been smeared for various things. It called a kook, as they did to Ron Paul a million times.
Yep. And also too, I'm remembering like a Saturday Night Live. It was
Dana Carvey.
Was it him or was it Phil Hartman that was? Oh no, you know what it was? It was Perot's running mate. That there was the VP debates, and he said something like, a woman's right to choose shall not be infringed. Period. And that was all he said. And then I think it was Phil Hartman was doing him and was just like rah rah and just yelling and stuff. And anyway, and I I'm a shit. I went along with it. Like I let SNL tell me who was a moron and who was crazy and stuff back then. So anyway, there you go.
Yeah, a lot of us did. It's too early for my questions, I guess. Let's play your next clip.
Yeah, let's do it.
It's called the free trade origin myth that kind of goes through the chapter and verse on all these various things.
The way it was presented to me as someone who was always conservative and for markets and repeated all the slogans and all that, and was living in the world where like I didn't know a single person who disagreed, talk about a bubble, was that free market economics in the way that the United States was doing it was not really an instrument, wasn't even a theory. It was like a physics principle.
Right.
It's just true. Okay. So, and to the extent that you deviate from it, you get punished. To the extent that you hew to it, you're rewarded because like gravity, it's just real.
Right. And this is the fundamentalism.
But I had no idea that this was like the UN something that people who are understandably like horrified by what they just gone through, the World War,
Yeah.
it was part of their reaction to that. And they're like, this will prevent that from happening again.
Yeah, and another good example is, so if you go back, so Samuelson is the key post-World War textbook.
Mm-hmm.
There's a prior textbook by a guy named Alfred Marshall, who's kind of seen as the father of like modern economics, right? Like Adam Smith is like the original guy.
Right.
Alfred Marshall is a British economist, probably the first one to actually be called an economist. No one would have called Adam Smith an economist back in the day. So Marshall writes probably the first economics textbook, comes out in like 1890. And he says essentially nothing positive about free trade. He actually has a whole section, the comparative advantage is this idea that, free trade, works out great for both sides. And it's attributed to a guy named David Ricardo, who was a great, early 1800s economist. Marshall has a whole section called The Narrowness of the Ricardians, where he specifically says, look, like, Ricardo has this nice theory, has some good math associated with it, but it only works in very limited circumstances. It makes a lot of sense that Britain as a global empire is promoting it, but there are lots of people it doesn't work for. The Americans don't believe it. The Germans don't believe it. And he even has this hilarious footnote where he says a lot of these ideas basically seem to be used as a way for like people to put one over on the working class. And so, like, again, all of this, and then if you even go back to Ricardo, like, and Adam Smith, these guys, as I was saying, Adam Smith knew the invisible hand didn't work automatically. Ricardo, when he's talking about free trade, he gives the example of how it could work. The famous example is England specializes in cloth,
Right.
Portugal specializes in wine, and here's all the great ways it works for them to trade. Right there on the same page, he says, by the way, this only works if capital is immobile. Meaning, if the British cloth makers can't pick up and go make the cloth in Portugal, it's right there. And then even more, he notes, and he hopes that never changes. That the idea that basically people were going to be stuck investing and doing business in their own countries was one of the core premises of any of this working.
Okay, so a lot there. I will try to be brief, but over the weekend, Adam, I actually read the entire appendix in Marshall's 1890 book, his discussion of the evolution of economic theory. And at first I was thinking, I can't believe on a weekend I got to sit here and read this to get ready for a podcast episode. But then I was like, no, this is awesome. This is my vocation. This is great. Because it really was cool stuff. So anyway, just real quickly on this, and partly why I'm going through this is I did have some people sending me Oren on Tucker and saying, Bob, I'd love to hear you guys talk about this. So that's why we're doing this, folks, because it's for you. But also, I feel like if I don't set the record straight here, it may get lost. Because when this episode dropped, and the reason I'm just saying is because Phil and I have been feuding, but Phil Magnus was part of a Law and Liberty symposium, I guess, a year or two ago, where Oren Cass was like the lead guy, and then they had Phil and Don Boudreau and I think some other people responding. And so that there we clipped in the beginning where Oren says, my essay, The Free Trade Origin Myth, that's what he's referring to. So we'll link here, folks, if you want to get into that stuff. So anyway, so Phil, in response, when this episode on Tucker dropped, said, Oren here's repeating this, but as I explained to him back then, this is really what Alfred Marshall was talking about in context, and so he's just a serial liar. So let me here now explain. I'm not trying to just ride the fence. I understand why both people, I get why Phil genuinely believes Oren is just lying and refusing to see. And I understand why Oren is like, what are you guys talking about? I'm showing you blah, blah, blah. Right. So I really do see how both sides are, going to war on this and genuinely think they're in the right. So let me just explain the nuance. Okay. So David Ricardo famously has comparative advantage. I'll link, folks, if you want some other like Mises. I've gone through, an hour length podcast episode explaining it. But the idea was just using simple math. You can show that, even if one country, if its workers can make two goods, both of them with fewer labor hours per unit, you might think they don't benefit from trading with some other country where it takes their workers more hours to make either unit. But actually that's wrong because the opportunity cost is, still different. And so the country that's better at both should specialize in the thing that it's really good at. and then make more of it than it is going to use, export it to the other country. And the idea is the trade-off that it gets more units of the other good per unit of the thing it's really good at than if it just, pulled its workers out of that and made them make the other thing. That's the way it works. Okay. And so that's called comparative advantage as opposed to absolute advantage. And in his discussion, Ricardo says he's spelling out the assumptions, like saying, so for this discussion, I'm going to assume the labor and the capital are fixed in each country, and that all they can do is ship the finished goods across, the borders. And then in that case, blah, 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 and results follow. And so he says, as Oren's saying, so to be clear, if capital could move, well, then obviously the capital would just flow to the country where and the workers would go to where it's most advantageous, and then everything would just get made there. And then he says, because for various reasons, like people like their homeland and where they grew up or whatever, they have a preference to stay there. And he said, preferences which I very much support and would be sad to see if they change, something like that, right? So it's not correct to say that David Ricardo admitted if you took this assumption away, then all of a sudden free trade doesn't work. He was just spelling out, this is the assumptions for my thing here for this result. And, oh yeah, I like the fact that we live in a world where people in England don't want to just move to wherever the rate of return is the highest. Like that would bum me out. He didn't use that phrase. Okay, so that's there. But as far as what Marshall did, just real quickly here, folks, in his essay, Oren quotes a part from the thing where Alfred Marshall is referring to the Ricardians, and it's, says words of the effect that, yes, these conditions only apply to England. And then Phil, in his rebuttal essay, said, no, go in context, go look it up. And you can see in that paragraph, he starts out by saying Ricardo had a very mathematical approach, and that can get you far in things like when he's dealing with money and international trade, he's on solid footing. But then when he gets into, what he's most known for, which is like the distribution of income and, the national produce, how much goes to the capitalists, how much goes to the workers, how much goes to the landowners, which is very famous in terms of like the Ricardian model, there it breaks down. And that's the part where in the footnote, Marshall is warning and saying there are a lot of people who are like against like factory legislation, for workers' rights and stuff, who point to Ricardo's model, not realizing its limitations and, trying to put one over on the workers. So it's clear in context, Marshall excluded trade theory from this criticism of the Ricardians and how they roll. But so that's why Phil thinks Oren's just lying, that this has been pointed out to him and he's still now going on Tucker and say, but later on, when Marshall is talking about other economists and stuff, he says the Germans, like under List, have pointed out the weaknesses in the British free trade doctrines that, Ricardo and others expounded, and said, yeah, it's not surprising that the global empire propounds this theory that was very advantageous to them, but actually isn't good for a country like Germany or the United States. And then that there were, and the U.S. Economist also had serious criticisms of the Ricardian approach. And so the idea was I'll end right here, Adam. Sorry, it's taking so long. But the idea was Marshall was sympathetic to these critics who were saying, if you're already a manufacturing powerhouse, then you like free trade. But if you're a country that's behind where England is at the time, you might want to have protectionist barriers to bring your industry, up to speed. And so it's not shocking that in the Ricardian model, like all that stuff is left out. Okay, so given Oren's perspective, you can see why he's saying, yeah, see, Marshall was talking about all the stuff I'm talking about, right? And he's not wrong and he's not lying, and it's not out of context. So again, it's kind of nuanced that Phil is right. The particular quote that Oren led with was out of context, and that's all you had to work with. You just say, yeah, Oren didn't understand it or he's duplicitous. But other parts where he does come back, and also too, Phil should know that because Oren had, a response to the rebuttal where he went through all this stuff. So I'm not calling Phil a serial liar. I'm just saying using Phil's criterion, he would be a serial liar at this point. So I'm just saying that. So judge not lest you be judged. Okay, I think I've done enough with that, and I will turn it back over to you, Adam.
Well, thank you, good sir, and thank you for doing all that reading.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to do it. Yeah, I couldn't evaluate the claims to Marshall, and I read a Samuelson textbook way back in the day. It certainly didn't strike me to characterize it as, free market. Certainly not from the Austrian perspective. So I just thought that was weird. But what freaked me out about the clip you chose is that the belief in free markets, or the favoring of them, was, I mean, Tucker was literally cackling at how stupid it was to think that this magical theory, you could just wave your arm and say abracadabra, and the free choices of people, unconstrained by government, would lead to a panacea or something. And I just thought it was weird for it to be characterized like that without describing the actual argument and what the opposite would be, which would be managed trade, where people, I'm sure Cass and Oren and Tucker would, flawed humans, fallen humans, deciding what should be. Like, for example, we don't have it in the clip, but Oren Cass literally wants government to direct the allocation of capital. He praises China and Korea and Taiwan and Germany for doing that, and he also openly calls for a complete disentangling of the United States and China, and instituting, literally, he called it a Cold War against them. So it's not like it's not like we're just poo-pooing the idea of free trade and saying they got a few things wrong or screwed up some assumptions. They're saying, no, what we want instead is managed trade, and I'll tell you exactly how to do it. And
I think do we have in the clips about the industrial policy? Now he's just picking
so.
like magnets and semiconductors and some.
We don't have that.
It was, unfortunately, folks, like Adam and I we have way more clips, and we realize we got to whittle them down. And I decided that me going into the footnotes of Alfred Marshall's 1890 Principles book was way more important than talking about magnets. But yeah, there is a part where it is sort of like, the hubris that Oren's just going to say, well, we definitely need industrial policy because we need this, and this, to plan for those. And we need the government just to make sure, like, they got to just make sure that the U.S. retains the capacity to produce those things. Because if we go to war with China or something, that, we need to be able to build semiconductor chips and blah, blah, blah. And then, he has the 10% tariff he recommends just to sort of like put the thumb on the scale to give a preference for U.S. businesses. And he even goes so far, I was wondering if you caught this, Adam.
Called it a free market solution.
Yeah, he said it's a very free market solution.
Yeah.
Which to me, again, like just when someone like proposes a minimum wage or something, you say, okay, well, why not $200 an hour? So the same thing here. Well, if 10% is good, why not have a 200% tariff to really give an advantage to U.S. industry? And at some point you'd say, well, no, that would be too much because then we would be, making things at home that made more sense to import. I'm like, well, right. And that's why a 0% tariff is actually the free market. Like that's what balances the correct incentives in terms of, that argument. So, and also too, just to address in case someone's, well, what do you say about it? Like the magnet thing. So folks, again, he said something like, or Tucker said, yeah, I just read, like, we've got a 2-week supply of magnets because of, the trade war that's brewing with China. And I think magnets are the kind of thing that you could stockpile. Right. I mean, I don't know, like, do they lose their magnetivity over a while or magnetism? I don't know, but it's not like eggs or something where, there's a limited shelf life and you can't, just import 2 years worth of eggs and so on. So anyway, I thought with stuff like that, like that's clearly the market. Like, in other words, if it's so obvious that, Tucker Carlson and Oren Cass just sitting around shooting the breeze can list off 5 things that, for national defense reasons, we clearly need this stuff. Well, then, okay, by the same token, then entrepreneurs can realize, let's either, if it's something that can be stored, let's go ahead and stockpile it. And so we'd have more than a 2-week supply, but also, you can, like a ski lodge can be vacant and, shuttered in the summer, and then they open it up in the winter when it makes sense. And likewise, you could have factories and things that it will import right now while it makes sense, but they have the capacity sitting there waiting to, take the mothballs out and get the thing up and running if there is even a 1% chance of a trade war. You know what I mean? So all these scenarios, markets could handle those things. And the idea, and it just seems kind of far-fetched to say, oh no, it's because that entrepreneurs who could make billions of dollars in this scenario, they don't see things as easily as Tucker and Oren sitting around podcasting do.
Yeah, and they want to use government power to enact these things. Like, I don't really favor globalization either, because I think our version of it is really forced and subsidized and weird and managed, not the result of a free market at all. Whereas a guy like Oren Cass, and I guess Tucker, they don't like globalization because he's a national mercantilist, and at least for the certain industries that he thinks are important, and he's wise enough, I guess, to know what they all are. And I think he's weaselly, especially with this framing, just like that thing. A tariff is basically a free market tool. Don't you know that, guys? And he did this move over and over, where he's looking at the incredible Byzantine of government regulations and taxes and EPA mandates and all the things, minimum wage, all the things that made labor here way more expensive, such that people will start looking for cheaper labor solutions, such that they'll start automating. You can't find a person to order a Big Mac from anymore. It's all kiosks and whatnot. And, there's all these distortions of the free market that are leading these weird market reactions. But then Cass, in this interview, over and over said, what we've got here is a free market. In fact, he says after 91, they did all these things to make our economic policy really an arrow in the quiver of our foreign policy. The deep state is making these calls, and he still calls it a free market. And which is just weaselly. We have the same problem with progressives, right? They look at all these quote unquote market failures and say, see, this is what the free market gave us. Well, now you've got these right-wing guys like Cass going, I don't like the way the market, the results are. We can't have a free market. See, because look what the free market delivered. Without saying once all the things that make this not a free market. He didn't say that once, not once.
Yeah, that's true. I think, in fairness, tell me if you disagree. I think it's more accurate to say he kept blaming free market fundamentalism for what we have.
Yeah.
I don't know that he ever literally said in the U.S., the past 30 years, we've had a free market the way that Milton Friedman wanted.
Well, the accusation is in the omission. I mean, if you're going to say we've been suffering under free market fundamentalism and just not say, oh, and by the way, it hasn't delivered us anything like a free market, well, then you must be blaming a free market, right?
I mean, yes, but again, it's partly because I know more about what his position is, that a big thing he points to is the normalization of having China come into the WTO and the most favored nation or whatever the term is, for giving them the favored tariff rates that locked in. And that happened in 2001. And if you look at a chart of U.S. manufacturing jobs, they were declining before that, but they just fall off a cliff right around that time. So you're right. I'm not disagreeing with you, and that's part of my message to the MAGA folks here is to say, yeah, the trade deficit's a thing and all that, but it's not because of free trade. But I am just saying, Cass does have some specific things that a bunch of dozens of economists, when that went down, all lined up and said, we all agree that the opening up trade with China is going to be the path to prosperity and so that's part of the context, but in which he's saying that. I think if cornered, and like when I interviewed him and was pointing to some of the charts, and I was showing well, you see, U.S. manufacturing output actually kept rising after China came in the WTO. When it leveled off was after Obama came in the financial crisis. So doesn't it look like maybe there was something there, and it's not like libertarian types were praising the Obama administrations for their free market policy reforms, and he oh yeah, there's a lot I didn't like under Obama. So anyway,
yeah, I mean, and plus he's upset that we're losing manufacturing jobs, even if manufacturing were going up, but it was being done with fewer people. I think he'd still object because he wants these employees to have families, and his whole thing is a family oriented conservatism, of which the classic job in the steel mill is like a part of it or something.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting to say the counterfactual. Suppose U.S. manufacturing output just kept rising like it always had done, even though it was done by fewer and fewer workers. I'm not sure. You're right. That would be good to see what he would do. But part of why I get where he's coming from, and I'm telling the standard libertarian types to just, hang on a second before they bite his head off, is their response, like to say, oh yeah, it's just like agriculture. You know, we had a bunch of people working on farms in the year 1850, and that just kept shrinking over time, but we get more and more food. That hasn't happened with manufacturing. And I think the next clip we'll get into that was happening for a while, where fewer manufacturing workers were making more and more stuff. So it looked like genuine, no, that's just progress. But then that did reverse. So I can see why Cass is saying, no, what you guys are telling me as to why we shouldn't worry about this stuff doesn't fit the data. You guys are just being free market fundamentalists.
Yeah, but like with most data, aren't there a zillion variables and you just can't eliminate them, in the counterfactual? Like, what do you think about my hypothesis that, it's not just chasing cheap labor, it's running away from over-regulated capital such that it's harder to build things in America, and it meets regulations and minimum wages.
Yeah. Why don't we, let me address that right now to make sure we're not losing anybody. What my point is, what I'm saying to you, Adam, though, is if you look at most of the responses to Cass, and I've been watching them, they are not saying, oh yes, you're right, there really is something screwed up with the U.S. economy and the American families getting just crushed. And that's why we have these chronic trade deficits are because of Nixon stupidly took us off the gold standard and blah, blah, blah. But you're just misdiagnosing the problem. And really what they're saying is, no, the reason we have trade deficits is the U.S. is awesome. Investors around the world want their capital to flow here. So they have to send us more goods than we send them. And, look at U.S. real wages keep growing up. And those charts that seem to show that there's been this, divergence between pay and productivity is just because those people are liars or idiots. And no, if you adjust for benefits and blah, 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 people get paid more now than they did before. And then these people telling you inflation's higher than the government says, they're all stupid. No, everything is awesome. Everything is awesome right now. Like, that's what they're telling him. And if you don't get that, go take Econ 101. That's what they're telling him.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying that's not a good idea for the people who voted for Trump. You saying that is goofy.
Yeah, I find myself in a weird situation. On the one hand, I am a free trader. I hate managed trade. I don't want the government involved. I hate these tariffs. I think they're destructive. On the other hand, I'm really grossed out and disgusted by the Chinese Communist Party. Got an episode coming out next week about what they've done to my beloved Hollywood movies by just forcing them to censor themselves or they'll withhold access to that enormous market. And both Hollywood and the NBA have just bent over backwards, prostituting themselves to do what the leader of a communist party orders them to do, just for the almighty dollar. And
I know that there was like the basketball player that tweeted something and changed, but what and the Hollywood
the general manager?
What is it with the movie? Like what did they?
Oh, it's a zillion.
They don't talk about Hong Kong being a separate.
There's that
thing or something.
They totally got Hollywood to take a Martin Scorsese film and just memory hole it, just because it criticized the way the Chinese Communist Party.
Wait, it was my understanding that Mao Zedong killed Jimmy Hoffa. Are you saying they scrubbed that?
Well, all of this will be revealed in a future episode of Haman Nature, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the point being, like, during COVID, I got a little freaked out about how our most important supply chains are going halfway across the world, and that's a fragility that I'm not really comfortable with. Can't we do these things in this hemisphere or in this continent? Or on the other hand, I don't want the government. Like, I believe the government and its insane regulatory policies drove that business away. I don't want them to. Like the little old lady who swallowed a fly. I don't want them to add regulation and regulation to regulation to fix what they caused in the first place. Right. So I find myself in a weird spot.
Can I say one other quick thing on this? Because somebody was interviewing me today on a separate thing, and he held up the book the healthcare book I did with Doug McGuff, The Primal Prescription, and he was asking me about, and I realized that my feeling at the time against like the knee-jerk right-wing libertarian conservative types was the same thing that I just said to you 5 minutes ago here, Adam, that when Obamacare was first being proposed, and then when it first came in, a lot of the Republican conservative, talk show, Sean Hannity kind of guys were just telling the progressive Democrats who were in favor of, quote, reform, that what are you talking about? We got the best healthcare system in the world. You want to go to Canada and wait, 3 years to get a hip replacement? This is, and just saying that, the U.S. has a free market in healthcare and insurance, and that's why we're so awesome. And quit your belly aching. And so what we try to do in the book was say, no, there really are a lot of screwed up things. And what we
course.
have right now is the furthest thing from a free market. But so
course.
my point was, yes, it would be annoying, Adam, for the interventionists to say, oh, the U.S. has, capitalist healthcare and look how awful it is. Like, that's a dirty, rotten lie. But there were plenty of Republicans who were saying, yes, we have free market capitalist healthcare in the U.S., and that's why it's so awesome. And Obama, keep your dirty socialist hands off it.
Yeah, it is vexing. It's a problem we libertarian free market types run into all the time. All right, let's play your last clip.
Okay.
And so I don't know if Europe has the civilizational will. I don't know if they have the understanding of their interests. And because of the way the EU is structured, I don't even know if they have this is something that could also pretty much break apart the EU. You could have some countries that say, well, wait a minute, we do want that deal with the US. And if we can't get that through the EU, then the EU doesn't work anymore. That's where I think you're going to see the most tension. And then you'll see countries that are going to be in China's sphere, right? Pakistan. I think a country like Vietnam is a very interesting question, which direction they might go. Yes. At the end of the day, the idea isn't that we sort of are going to be able to get the whole world to gang up on and oppress China. The idea is that we're going to be in a world with two powers that have two very different economic and political systems and different spheres of influence.
Boy, that is best case if we wind up there.
And that goes back to your, the question about like, well, but isn't this going to start a war or whatever? It's like, no, this is the best case. This is the formula for actually having, I think, a much more sustainable equilibrium.
Yeah, like a peaceful multipolar world.
Yes.
Which, by the way, we've had for all of history, up until it ended in 1991. Oh.
Well, and this is that's such an important point that people keep raising this as like what is this strange, unprecedented thing that the crazy Donald Trump is doing? It's like no. Like, first of all, like this literally was U.S. policy for the Cold War, right? And like, not to mention, this was the way foreign affairs always worked for however many hundred years before the Cold War. It is only people who think the world started in 1991 that don't understand what is happening.
The problem, though, is like a deeper problem, and I hope I pray it's resolvable, but it's like, how do you pull back from hegemony? How do you scale back an empire without becoming Great Britain?
Yes. Well, and that goes to your question about sort of the costs, because there obviously are costs here. Some of them are the sort of direct just consumer costs. If you were relying on cheap stuff from China, you don't want to do that anymore. At least in the short run, there's going to be higher cost. I think in the medium to, not even just like someday, but within the 5 to 10 year window, you actually see the benefits overwhelm that. You see that if you actually return to an economic model that does encourage domestic investment, that does focus on, prosperity in places that aren't just a few big cities, that is oriented toward creating good jobs for everybody, you actually get more growth that way. I mean, the dirty secret of this post-Cold War period is we're supposed to do like globalization and efficiency and growth. Growth just keeps getting slower.
No, I know.
Investment keeps going down. In manufacturing, productivity has actually turned negative, which should not be possible in a capitalist economy. We are literally getting worse at making things. You need more labor in an American factory today than a decade ago for the same amount of output. And so this just isn't working. And going back to the kind of economic model that did drive our prosperity for so long, I think will be much better. The point about what happens after empire, that's bigger than the economic question. If this were just about the numbers and the production, I think you can see a very clear way out. The social and political and cultural question of what does the United States become? Can it return to the idea of a republic as, in fact, far superior to and more desirable than an empire? On paper, that sounds great. It shouldn't be a problem at all. In practice, for anyone who's studied history knows no one has ever really stuck that landing, and that is the challenge we have.
Okay, so a lot there. It was a bit of a long clip, but I did want to catch all those things. So, again, let me just the broader point that I said at the beginning is I'm trying to show people he's basically like a nerdier Pat Buchanan. You know what I mean? Like he's and we don't have time, or maybe you have one of your clips at it, but there was another part too where he's mocking the experts and he's saying, so that at this point in history now, that's just not going to resonate with the American public. That, if some guy gets up there from the State Department and says, oh, you shouldn't trust Donald Trump on tariffs because, the economic models all show that free trade superior and the experts say so. And then and Oren's, going along and saying, at this point, we can say, oh, were you the same experts that told us invading Iraq would be a good idea, or that, had the lockdowns? So he's definitely like, quote, on our side on a lot of these issues. And as you saw right there, he was very comfortable saying the U.S. has an empire that's unwinding. And the question is, can we go back to a republic? So my point is, that's why I'm saying I think it's a strategic mistake for Austro-libertarians to just say, oh my God, he doesn't agree with free trade. Get out of here, you idiot. You know what I mean? Like, I think we could try to work with that. As far as the productivity thing, so Adam and I were talking, folks, before, we both thought that sounded implausible. And I've even seen both the numerator and the denominator. Like, I knew the workforce was going down, and I knew that the denominator had stalled in terms of, the other way around, that the numerator had stalled, but I still assumed productivity had been rising. So let me just show you, folks, this chart is actually pretty shocking. Okay. So, folks, this is from the St. Louis Fed website. So this is manufacturing sector labor productivity output per hour for all workers. So this is inflation adjusted, and it's even adjusted per hour, right? It's not just looking at workers, because technically, they could have different work weeks and whatever. So you can see, in general, yeah, you would think over time more stuff is being manufactured in the U.S. than before, or per hour of worker labor time. And yep, that was going up at a steady clip. And then, okay, there was the financial crisis, so it went down, and you'd think it'd be going up again. Okay. And then it just, not just flatlines, or, not just tapers off, but it actually gently declines, such that right now, the far right end of that chart, it's a bit lower than it was 10 years ago. And you can just get if you didn't have any frame of reference, you might say, okay, is that bad? But you can look at the prior history. It's not that, oh yeah, it tended to go up a tiny little bit. No, I mean, it was going up exponentially, which would make sense. You'd think it would be growing a certain percentage amount year after year. And then you see, no, it just flatlines. So Adam, you're right. That's obviously not because China comes into the WTO, right? Because that would have been earlier in the second gray bars there, folks. That's showing the .com recession. And so that the line kept going up. So, but clearly something happened with, the financial crisis and arguably the Obama years, and we can speculate as to what that is, but that just totally screwed that up. Again, my point is, Adam, that most of the people responding to Oren Cass are not saying, oh yeah, you're right, something's really screwed up. What the heck is going on? Is it what the Fed was? That was QE? Maybe they had to do with it. Maybe it was the bailouts. Maybe it was, who knows? No, they're just saying, no, the U.S. economy is awesome. A trade deficit, like if I spend more at the grocery store, that's a trade deficit. So, the fact that foreigners want to, send us more stuff, that's because they want to invest in U.S. stocks. That's awesome. What are you talking about, dude? And I'm saying that chart, that's not because the U.S. economy is so awesome.
Yeah, terrible arguments. If I were a precocious student, I might raise my hand and wonder if that was a hollowing out of the capital structure, like companies not being willing to reinvest and maintain or improve their capital structure because of regime uncertainty, or who the hell knows, just some pile of regulations. You have any insight on whether that might be part of it, or?
Yes. Yeah, I do think there's a lot of regime uncertainty. In fact, because we were resurrecting this, you may recall I had a book that came out when Obama first came in on the Great Depression, because people were comparing Obama to FDR favorably, and I was saying, oh yeah, I agree, he is like FDR, and that's why we're in trouble. And so I went through, and yes, that was one of the big points that Robert Higgs argued was it was the regime uncertainty of the FDR administrations, that it wouldn't be enough just to look at like the explicit tax rates, or what did he do with the gold or whatever. It was that you didn't know what he was going to do, because he was just doing so much crazy stuff. Yeah,
with all those bailouts, the auto bailouts, and then the TARP and all that. You were saying at the time, what does this mean? How are people going to possibly invest their capital rationally in this whirlwind of uncertainty?
Right.
All right. let us switch over, if you don't mind, to at the beginning of this interview. They're talking about Oren Cass's vision of conservatism more generally. And my first clip is two that I'm going to try and mash together, two short ones.
It's not just a market or, an Olympics team. It is actually something with an identity within which people owe obligations to each other. And not everybody is raising kids, but if you're not, you have some obligation to the folks who are. You have some obligation to those kids. And as those kids grow up, they will in turn have obligations back to you. Their premise of obligations and duties, as opposed to merely rights and privileges, is that there are things that you should be doing even if they are not the thing that is the most fun at that moment in time, even if they are not the thing that you personally want to be doing at that moment in time. Sometimes just because it is the right thing to do and it is, something that is important to the well-being of those around you. A lot of times I think what you find in these moral traditions is that also in the long run, it is good for you too, that there's a recognition that humans are frail, flawed people, and simply pursuing, what the Economist would say is optimizing your well-being at every moment in time leads people to choose all sorts of things that are not actually good for them at all. And that's what I find fascinating about speaking about these kinds of concepts of obligation and duty in the good life is some people get very skeptical of this, say like, oh yeah, but no one's going to choose that when they could just have all this other stuff instead. But you step back and you look at all of the available data and you say, no, they will actually be happier if they choose all this stuff. People who are married are happier. People who have kids are happier. People later in life who have done these things live fuller lives overall. They also tend to earn more money. They have whatever it is you actually want to achieve in your life. It is almost certainly the case that making these kinds of decisions will be good for you too. The problem is just that in the moment when you're 23, that it's not necessarily a thing that you're going to choose.
That's right.
And in a sense, and this goes back to where you started with, what is conservatism? It's a recognition that for people to lead good lives and make good decisions, they need to be operating within this structure. They rely on institutions, their own families, ideally an education system, ideally the broader culture, to shape and form them and help them make these kinds of decisions that will benefit them, they themselves in the long run. We're not just asking for fixed bayonet charges, into machine guns. We're talking about things that will be good for them, will be good for those around them, will be good for their own kids, but that we know are not things that they're just automatically going to choose by themselves. And so just, this is the other thing that you just like, just like, well, why aren't we doing this? Part of it is people just don't like being constrained. Part of it is we have adopted this sort of what I call market fundamentalism, where economists and their way of thinking have somehow persuaded a lot of people that no, just everybody choosing what they think is good for them at every moment with no constraints is actually the way to optimize welfare for themselves, for the nation, for the economy. And that's just not true.
Shortly after that, he goes on to ridicule Milton Friedman and free to choose. He really, really, really doesn't like free markets. And he's not interested in ordering people to charge machine gun nests with fixed bayonets, but he is interested in using government power to tell you what to do, to force you to do things. And when he's talking about duties and obligations, he's putting that in contradistinction with individual liberty. It's not just the obvious truth that, yes, if you're going to be a useful member of the society and not a sociopath, you're going to adopt responsibility and have duties and obligations to other people. He's not talking about that. He's talking about forcing people into doing what's good for them, and actually they'll be happier. It's like a it's like a government mandated shotgun wedding or something. So that, like, from my libertarian perspective, I see Oren Cass's definition of conservatism just like progressivism, basically. Much like a progressive, he has a vision of what this society should be like, and he's going to use government power to make it so.
Mm-hmm.
And I happen to like his vision better than a progressive's. It's pro-family and much more wholesome. If I had to pick one, I'd pick his. But I'm a libertarian. I don't trust man to use government power to mold society in the image that he prefers. I think he's going to screw it up. This is what all authoritarians say. The means are the ends. If you use force to try and enact heaven on earth, you're going to poison the whole thing, including yourself. And it's just the old myth of the ring of power. Over and over and over again, these busybodies want to use force to make everybody act right. And I'm not about it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I am chuckling. I was trying to, you were going, I didn't want to like interrupt you when you were passionate. I was trying to come up with some way to zing it and be like, I know, it's like, this guy would look at, you have some toddler sitting in the high chair and he'd be like, I'm going to force you to feed the kid. I mean, what's this guy's deal? Okay, Adolf. So
you keep your nuance out of my passionate rant, Bob Murphy.
So yeah, I think you're right. And also like Matt Walsh does that a lot too. He'll openly just,
yes.
and what's his name? Michael Knowles too, but not as much. They'll just openly say, yeah, we think these things are better. And so that's why it's entirely appropriate for the government. And I know some libertarians will say, oh, you can't legislate morality, but yeah, homicide is illegal. And you say, oh, if you just outlaw drugs, they'll do it in the back alleys. Okay, well, why don't we say the same thing about robbing banks?
But how can a conservative not understand immediately, intuitively, the difference between voluntarily living a wholesome life and being forced to at the point of a gun? The latter one is just not going to work. You're not getting the virtue that you're aiming for.
Yeah, I think, tell me how you feel about this. I think part of what's going on is we have these fine distinctions. And so what's part of it, I think, Adam, is there are a lot of libertarians that we might call libertines, or let's call them left libertarian types, who they would oppose what Oren wants to do. Also, because they would say, we disagree with your vision of a good society, that, hey, if we want to have, if I want to have 18 spouses, then I should be able to do that. And if I want to marry my cousin, I should be able to do that. And who are you to tell me what to do? And blah, blah, blah. And if I want to just become addicted to heroin, that's my free choice. And, that you can't say anything one way, even morally speaking, you can't condemn what I'm doing because sin doesn't even exist. That's something used to control people and make you feel guilty.
You made a hard left turn there in the middle where I can't condemn morally. Sure I can.
Right. But I'm saying there are plenty of self-described libertarians who would talk like that. Right. So I'm saying, I think that's partly why, people like Oren and Matt Walsh or whatever might not see these findings and then might say, no, I'm against that. Yes, we can get to, and then just like, and the other distinction is the appropriate role for government. Like, have read our Bastiat and whatever and understand, oh wait, no, it's, we know with FDR was wrong because there's a big difference between negative rights and positive rights and things like that. Whereas if you haven't studied all that stuff, then yeah, you are going to end up just say, well, yeah, if I can use the government to stop people from murdering and raping, why can't I use it to keep them from using heroin? What's the difference? They're both bad things, and you agree in principle, unless you're an anarchist, that the government can stop bad things. And so why wouldn't they, if having families is a good thing, why don't we force everyone to pay for public schools? What's the difference? I don't get it. So I'm saying partly it's, I think, because they can't even make some of these distinctions because they don't have a theory of the proper role of government that's the same as what ours is, even, when we talk about the Night Watchman state or whatever.
Nothing gives libertarianism a bad name worse than libertarians. You are absolutely right. We didn't get a clip of it, or rather I did, but we had 20 and I didn't want to play them all. But he literally says that in principle, this is Oren Cass, universities and colleges are public institutions. And the government should decide what their curriculum is. If they're not just going to do the right thing on their own, then they should be state schools, and we'll tell them what to do.
I would like to, in fact, if I ever have him interviewing, I'm going to ask him to elaborate on that. So I agree that made my spidey senses tingle, but it's conceivable he would have said, yeah, because they get funding and whatever. And
but he didn't say that. It would have taken half a second. You're right. He could. I'd like to hear.
No, but he also didn't say exactly what you said either. You were reading into it. He just said, I was giving a talk somewhere and they didn't like such and such. And so I was thinking, well, you're basically a public institution. We don't know where he was. I mean, maybe
That's
they.
true. I'd love for
So.
I'd love for you to get that question on record. I don't know. My spidey sense is pretty good. We'll see. All right, let me continue on.
My last question refers back to what you first said, which is about the point of the system, which is to encourage and support and sustain healthy families and bright-eyed, impressive children who continue on the civilization. I don't think any person could disagree with that, and thank you for reminding us of it. What are specific policy changes in the next 5 years that could help that?
It's a great question, and I think it's important to think about it expansively, because it's great that we now have a, quote, family policy discussion in the U.S., but a lot of the times it is basically a, well, how big should the child tax credit be discussion. And to be clear, that is an important piece of it. And this goes back to the boomer discussion as well. We have a system of taxation and distribution in this country that overwhelmingly brings resources to retired people.
I've noticed.
And I don't think we should stop giving resources to retired people. I think, the fact that we have Medicare, the fact that we have Social Security are great things. But if there's any group to whom we should be focusing resources on, it is families raising kids who are the ones who have been, I think, most squeezed by these economic changes. And I don't think we should believe, if we manage to get them more resources through some sort of child benefit or child tax credit, like that's going to make people have more kids in the short run, right? I don't think that works very well. I don't think we want to be in the business of saying well, if we pay you, if we pay you a little more, will you have another kid? But what it will do is make the experience of being a family raising kids better. And in the culture, it will begin to shift what it feels like to be doing that and what people see about people who are doing that, not this constant struggle and getting squeezed, but a little more something that is actually viable and desirable and that we all have committed to supporting. And so both for the sake of the families and for the sake of the culture, I think that does make a big difference. I also think it's important to note that we will have to pay for that. And the people who will pay for it are the people who are earning a lot of money and don't have kids, which is the direction of distribution we should be leaning toward.
All right. So there were a lot of moments in this conversation where he starts to inch the velvet glove off the iron hand. And this is one of them.
I'm thinking the childless atheist is getting ready to complain here.
I'm not rich. But, he says people without kids will be taxed to pay for people with kids because it's a duty to the nation. And I'm just uncomfortable with one group of people getting in power and deciding who gets stolen from and where those resources get directed to. He just matter-of-factly says, guys like me should decide what the policy is for resource distribution. Well, that just sounds like a progressive to me. Yeah. They've got ideas too. And by the way, he supports Social Security and Medicare too. I mean, it's no problem. He
probably supports school vouchers too. He's probably one of those guys, Adam.
You stop it right now, Bob Murphy. Didn't say I supported him. I said if I could replace. So I don't know. This guy just he raises the hackles on the back of my neck because I think he is a wannabe authoritarian, and like many others that we've heard. And just because he happens to think, the vision of a good, wholesome life in general should be more family oriented, I agree with that. I just put the gun down, guy. I don't think that's how you get there.
Yeah. So my trolling aside, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I agree with it. It is interesting, though, when I don't know if he said it or somebody else did, but a similar thing that, the childless couples are going to have to pay more. And I think it was more like a Matt Walsh or somebody said it on the Daily Wire. People were freaking out. And I pointed out at the time that it's funny because
that's exactly what's happening. Right?
We're right. Because I retweeted the person who was flipping out about it and said, that's funny because if Elizabeth Warren proposed increasing the child tax credit, I don't think this person would be flipping out, but that's exactly the same thing.
In the current model, it's property
Mhm.
taxes in general that fund school systems
Right.
terribly. And if you're richer, you'll have a bigger house paying more money, right?
Right, and it's especially if you're rich and have no kids,
Rich
and
with no
same thing with the
kids.
child tax credit. That is literally, other things equal. If you're a taxpayer, then they give more of a tax credit to
So
couples
there
with
you
children.
go.
That
We're living in Oren Cass's utopia right now. Makes as much sense as calling what we live in right now a free market.
I mean, just to steal man it though. That's why he's going to say, "Why are you guys flipping out? You just agreed." What I'm saying, I just want to say, do more of these things, and you also agree you like my vision better than theirs. So what? I'm not radically changing the nature of the government. They are doing this right now, but I'm just making it more systematic. Like that, I
If
think
this
that's
is
what he would say.
if this is a prisoner's vote situation, and I had to vote between AOC's vision and this guy's, yeah, okay, I'll take this guy's. But
Okay, so you
my
would support him the same way you support school vouchers, is what you're telling me.
almost, I guess, almost. But yeah, as I'm hitting the button to vote for the
Yeah.
school voucher, I'm going to be giving a speech on how that we
Yeah.
should have a complete separation of
By the way,
school and
I'm just
state.
being Socrates here. I'm just trying to pull forth and let you think through the implications of your own positions. I'm not judging.
You're being Glenn Beck. You're just asking questions.
Yeah.
Just asking
I'm being
questions.
Candace.
The Candace now. She took his place. All right, I got one more just in
Okay.
case I haven't made my point. Here it goes.
And even just, this goes to the question of rights and privileges versus duties and obligations. Like, part of the reason progressives get very uncomfortable with that side of the discussion is because, well, like, wait a minute, that you just like infringed on something. And so there's a lot of, especially a place like Yale Law School, there's a lot of sensitivity to like, well, who are you infringing on with this view? And the answer is like, everybody. like, to be clear, I am an equal opportunity infringer on, I value liberty and would like to protect it, but I am an equal opportunity infringer on all liberty to the extent that it is being claimed to the exclusion of all of these other things that matter too, if we are going to have a society and a civilization at all. And that is, in my mind, what conservatism meant for most of modern Western history. And it's very exciting that a lot of people are now focused on it again.
All right. So there's the quote. I value liberty and would like to protect it, but I am an equal opportunity infringer on all liberty to the extent that it is being claimed to the exclusion of all these other things that matter too, if we're going to have a society or a civilization at all. End quote. And I hear, and now I, Oren Cass, am going to tell you what all those other things are. And I don't want to hear any but my individual liberty when I order you to pay for these things or do these things. I mean, these are the kind of arguments you get for pressing young people into national service right out of high school, right? It's good for them. It's good for the nation. I mean, what principled objection could you possibly make? It's good for people. I think he's got a lot of that in him. I think it's that lust for power that I hate it when Elizabeth Warren has it, and I hate it when a guy like Oren Cass has it too.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. Just for people to understand more of the context of that clip, I think earlier Tucker had said, as he often does, what you're saying here makes total perfect sense, and I don't understand who could disagree with that.
We're going to disagree.
Yeah, and then right. And so, and then Oren says, "Oh, well, it's funny you say. I was actually just at Yale Law School, and if I said something like, oh, rich people need to pay for the nuclear family, and we got to have traditional values and things like that, then I'm exaggerating, but so then some girl with blue hair and a nose ring is going to say, well, wait a minute, who are you, who are you coming for? That so she gets nervous, and that's why he was clarifying, and he thought he was being cute, and you didn't like it, but saying no, it's not that I am picking the white Anglo-Saxon 2-parent nuclear family to the exclusion of you with your non-binary lifestyle choices and things. It's not that I'm trying to oppress you and liberate these people over here. I'm saying we all have to pitch in to raise the next generation. Like, everybody has known that until last Tuesday. And that this isn't some radical thing I'm proposing. So, and
Yeah.
you do not have the freedom to just say, no, if you want to have kids, go ahead. I'm going to go that you grew up in a world like it's a good thing that your ancestors didn't think like you did. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. So that's what he's saying there.
I know. It's just that when you use force to get there, you strip all the virtue out of it. You just breed resentment and more rebellion. And they have a point, If the virtue is only achieved when you voluntarily take on these duties and obligations, you add a gun to it, and where's the virtue? We're getting a little over time. I had a weird question. It's more on the economic side again, but maybe you caught it too when Oren Cass was saying.
Can I say one thing? Are you going to remember it?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
I meant to bring it in with all the excitement and all the zinging. He did say something that was hilarious. Well, not hilarious, but amusing. In the clip you played earlier, he had said he was like lamenting how he too, Tucker, don't be embarrassed. Like I had a college paper where I was defending the virtues of free trade, and I said something like, "Oh yes, free trade might make you lose your job, but then you'll get a better one down the road." And I can't believe I wrote that. And so so number one, no, that's not. Strictly speaking, that's not what free trade says. If it did, then why would anyone be against it? Like, no, we quite clearly teach, yes, there can be winners and losers from getting rid of a tariff. You get rid of a tariff on Japanese cars, that can hurt Detroit automakers and the workers at those plants, but it helps all the consumers, right? So that's standard. And yeah, you can say in the long run, you might get a better job, but even with tariffs in place, in the long run, everyone's income goes up too. So that's not really the case for free trade, right? So I would just say you learn that. But then what was ironic is later when he's explaining his system and he goes, oh yeah, in the short run, you might take a hit because now stuff from China costs more, but in the long run, I think you'll be better off. It's like, okay, so you do the exact same thing, dude.
A little irony, a little hypocrisy. And it's not just the tariff issue or the import-export issue, but like all improvements involve creative destruction, right? The guy who trained to be the absolute best elevator operator in the world is going to take a hit, when we just don't do that anymore. We get a machine that makes the thing go up and down.
Yep. If AI cures cancer tomorrow.
Exactly. Are we going to
Well, then we're going to have Biden come back, so that's one thing.
Oh, no. Let's wait. Just hold off for a few more weeks.
Oh, wait. Too soon.
So anyway, he's talking about...
Oh, I get what you... Okay, I got it. I thought you were telling me, no, Bob, you can't joke about... I mean,
no.
I knew you were being facetious, but I thought you meant, well, we got to wait a little bit before we can just hit him on that.
You could joke now. Just don't release the pills.
Right. I got what you're doing. Sorry, I underestimated you, my friend.
Sorry, Dr. Jill. So he's insisting on these tariffs and this managed trade to the point where he is insisting on, quote, balanced trade, country by country. Like not even that our net exports and imports balance or whatever, but that there's an equation between us and each country, quote, we interact with, which seemed like a bridge too far, even for protectionists. Isn't that just weird?
It would be weird if he was saying that. I don't. Do you have that clip and you just chose not to run it? Because if so, I think you should run it.
No.
Because I don't want to tell you you're wrong. I'm pretty sure. So let me say some stuff that is true.
I'll find it for later.
Okay, let me say. I'll say some stuff that's definitely true, and then it may shed light. But so because this is one of the things, Adam, that I had Oren on the Infi podcast, because I'll make this the brief version, folks. So on Twitter, when the so-called Liberation Day happened, and all those tariffs came out, and then AEI, American Enterprise Institute, was against it, and they went, they had a paper, and they were, among other things, like mocking the fact that these were called reciprocal tariffs, when no, they were just looking at the trade deficit we had with these people, and that's crazy, and which is fine, they're correct, and that was stupid. And then they had this line in there about the bilateral trade deficit that the U.S. has with any other particular country is driven by a host of factors, including blah, 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 comparative advantage. And, they listed like 5 things, let's say. And so then Oren retweeted that and said something like, explain this to the caveman lawyer here in simple terms. I don't see why the comparative advantage would have much to do with our trade deficit with any given. And so all of, Phil Magnus and all the people were just like, oh my God, this guy literally doesn't understand Econ 101. What an idiot. And I knew Oren was smarter than that. And so I had him on the show. And so the long and short of it is he was acknowledging that comparative advantage could explain the mix of products that you make. But like if you just saw the production possibilities frontiers of the two different countries, you would know what their comparative advantages were, but that wouldn't pin down what the trade deficit was. You would need to have more information, and that's true. You need to know like consumer preferences and stuff. Yeah. And so and then even there though, he said ultimately, like the comparative advantage, you're explaining trading stuff for stuff. And so he was saying that could with a triangular trading pattern, it could explain why each country has a bilateral deficit with one country, but then they would also have to have a bilateral surplus with the other one. That in general, your trade would be balanced if you were just using the basic Ricardian model. Yeah. And I think that's true. So you could have a trade deficit with one country or another, but he's just saying in general it wouldn't be. And then to get to that next level, it would, in principle, you could use comparative advantage, but it had to be pretty subtle. Like the goods you had in mind were like you were selling them widgets and delivered in the year 2050, like because you have to bring the time element involved that they're like investing, they're like lending you money or buying assets now with sending you goods and you get what I'm saying? Like, like the US right now, the fact that it has a trade deficit with the rest of the planet Earth is because foreigners are acquiring US assets. Like they're getting treasuries and they're buying, stock in US companies and they're getting their hands on like real estate. And they pay for that by sending us more TVs and clothes and stuff than we send them. And so just saying comparative advantage. And if you look, the simple models of comparative advantage don't explain that. So to be clear, last thing, I'll shut up, Adam. I am not saying, and therefore tariffs make sense. That's not what I'm saying. But Oren's point was these economists just fall back on comparative advantage, these models of two countries with two goods. And no, what's happening right now cannot be explained by that. And don't tell me I need to go reread that a model of two goods in two countries if I think right now something screwy that the U.S. has been running humongous trade deficits for 30 years. That's what he was saying.
Sure.
Or he has said that. So maybe in your clip he did say what you're saying, but I didn't catch that. So I'm wondering if you might have misunderstood what he meant.
I'll share it off air and we'll clarify. Maybe I misunderstood. maybe you missed it.
Maybe.
Quick accounting question.
Yes.
Like, they send us over these goods and we give them these greenbacks and then they got to do something with them. So they buy our T-bills or they buy assets or they use them in transactions, reserve currency of the world, all that. What is the accounting? How does it work when they come here like on vacation or something and spend a couple $100,000 on a bag at the Wynn buy a purse at the Wynn or something? Is that handled when the currency exchange happens? So it's not taken into account at all.
It's construed as an export. So
that's an export. Like they're riding on a.
If Japanese tourists go to Disney World, that is a U.S. export to foreigners.
Okay.
Now I don't know in practice, like how do they catch every little thing? I don't know, but in principle, if you had all the data, that's the way it would be booked.
Okay, I got you. So you're in favor of tariffs. I think it's good that we cleared this up.
No, this is why we can't allow immigration, because we want the Japanese to come as tourists. And then,
what if the strawberries are in season though? They can pick them, right?
Just don't give them to any of those kids in the high chair. They don't They're not owed anything. If they.
Bob loves tariffs and he hates feeding infants.
If it maximizes your utility function to feed the toddler, then by all means. But I wouldn't want to impose upon you a constraint.
All right. Before we say goodbye, is there anything else? Any final ribbon you want to tie or bow you want to tie on this whole episode?
Yeah. So I think, again, the big picture here is I think the hardcore libertarian types, we have a problem where I think we're right. And there is a danger that anybody who doesn't see the world exactly as you do, you just rush to assume they're evil and or stupid. And I think just strategically, that's not a great idea, because we have to convince more people. And so, yes, if you encounter somebody that's just a demonstrable, like a Paul Krugman or something, yeah, I wasn't trying to win him over after a certain point, clearly.
No, you're kidding.
Yeah, right. So there is, I'm not saying you got to always just go in and like have no history of the person and just say, no, I'm just going to start from scratch and just give my best to this guy. I'm not saying that, but I am. Well, at the very least, last thing I'll say is when there are populist types in particular who are gaining favor and the attention of the masses by pointing out things, it is a strategic mistake to just poo-poo and, oh, no, you're just a bellyacre, and especially if what you're saying is not correct.
I agree.
Right. And that, no, if like you say, if you're a libertarian type, then go figure out what the interventions are that are causing the problem and point those out. Don't just say, oh, what he's saying is just going to make it worse. Idiots, just shut up. Like that's not going to appeal to people.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right. Well, thank you, Bob. For show notes and links to the things we've talked about, check out the video description. Or you can go to bobmurphyshow.com. They'll be there. Or you can go to hamannature.com or hamannature.substack.com. And while you're there, why don't you sign up to get my my articles? I write stuff. I got thoughts. You'll love them. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, and Bob, this was awesome.
Take care, everybody.